So please join me in welcoming Brad to the stage.
Well, I hope I can live up to that. My God. So I'll talk tonight about the work, about a way of thinking about the work. I mean, it's interesting in the introduction and wondering a little bit why I am where I am. I think relative to light and the kind of pursuit and investigation of light as a material thing, as an experiential thing, I think it has everything to do with growing up in the Pacific Northwest where there's no light. And so the sacredness of it, the joy it brings, the wonder it brings, the sense of awe in many ways, it has to come from, I think, those beginnings, realizing how precious light is. And then structure has everything to do with my education. When Lou Kahn passed away, a bunch of his students fled to the West Coast, to the University of Oregon, and took over the school. And I was the benefactor of that. So those elements of structure and light, as anachronistic as they are in today's culture, I think that's the right word. Those are the things that I continue to be fascinated by, continue to be inspired by, and pursue in the work. So I'll talk about process a bit, about the kind of visual industry that we are involved in, a kind of exploration of possibilities at Allied Works, and the search for architecture. We were talking on the way in, I mean, in some ways, finding the architecture, the reason to do architecture, what the architecture should be, could be, whether architecture is even appropriate or even applies to the problem at all. Those are not apologetic concerns. Those are things that I truly think about in any project. So when I travel and look, I try to find places where architecture exists, and often not in buildings. That meandering path in the river where a specific species of tree has filled in, to me that's a force of architecture. The wind that blows that rock when the mud flats are wet across that plain are architecture. The temporary canopies for prayer at the mosque, and that amazing American Indian bridge of cantilevered and strapped logs. I mean, anything that I can find, microcosms of climate, where a 500-foot elevation changes everything, and qualities of light that shift. It's basically the forces that act on things, trying to find those forces of specificity, trying to give voice to forces, to characteristics, to elements that lead you to some understanding and insight. And those maybe sound bold or presumptive, but those are things that I believe in. And I look at landscape, I look at objects, and I look a lot at art. I think in the era of my education in the 80s, and well, anyway, I won't go on for that. But artists have an ability to pursue ideas in a kind of crystalline, concentrated ways that we only dream of, I think, as architects. And so using them as models, using their practice as models, the integrity of their pursuit, the concentration of ideas. I had the opportunity to work with Richard Serra to cite his piece, Joe, in the first museum I did in St. Louis, and thinking about his process and the discipline and the rigor of working in a single medium for his whole career, and the breakthroughs, literal breakthroughs and invention that he's encountered. Working with Ann Hamilton on projects unrealized, and having the chance to work with Doug Aiken. There's this house we did in Dutchess County, and they have 450 acres. It's a humble estate, and significant art collectors, and they invited Doug to come up to the land to walk the site and think about where he might site a piece, and he wanted to meet me, and I told him we were in design in the house, and I told him this idea of this kind of visceral glass house with clear and transparent and etched glass, and how we were trying to sort of mirror and dissolve into the landscape, and the light on the surface would change the reading of the house. And he got very excited, and he decided to film the landscape, basically do what the house couldn't do, or do what the house was trying to do, only better. He filmed the landscape for a year and then projected it. We cited 16 projectors. And when the sun goes down and you flip the switch, basically the landscape is reflected back on the house in this incredible 20-minute video where the house truly dissolves, but decontextualized in time and season. So back to working, back to a way of working, a way of investigating. With us, there's a kind of urgent search for what the architecture can do, what it can reveal. And I think that's an important concept. When, what can architecture add to a conversation of a place or an activity, industry or a structure, or just a general understanding. And so this is just a little short vignette where I got this project. I kind of laugh about this, but it's true. So I got this project to do the guest house for that main house, before the main house was built. Walk the site, deciduous forest. I'd never really worked or even been in a deciduous forest. I come from a place of conifer forests that suck all the light out of the world, just these black holes, right? These kind of mystical black environments. And I walked the site in the snow and all of these beautiful black lines of the trunk of trees. And I just wanted to weave the house into that gorgeous composition of drawings that was there. And it led to a steel structure that attempted to do that, and then led to a house that wove through that landscape with a series of inverted cantilevers. I won't go into that. And ended up being filled with glass and wood panels, and then planted with that bed of ferns by Michael van Valkenburg, which amplified the whole perception of this thing weaving through the forest. So all of those tools of the drawing to try to understand that context and how we might heighten a sense of that, an experience of that place, the models, and of course the architecture itself are integrated, and it's an integrated search in scale. And I think that's what's been fascinating to me of late. I mean, it's really interesting. We got to do the furniture and plates and all of the small bits of the new restaurant at 11 Madison Park, and working in that scale and understanding what those things mean to the body and the hand and the eye, and at the same time working in monumental structure, which you'll see shortly, and understanding how different all of those endeavors are. But we started a project initiated by talking to curators and directors that we had been working with in museums who would see things, see these sketches, see these concept models, as we call them, see these bits of our visual inquiry in the office, and they always said we should have a show. And I never intended them to be shown. They really are work product. They're not even presentation products. They were for us. I never had the confidence to show that to a client and say, this is the beginning of your building. Although I've done it now, and we've lost a lot of projects because of that. I'll show you some. So they found, they would see all these bits, and so they said, you should do the show. And finally, kind of back to what Nader was implying there, I thought in this time of image making, of instant products of architecture, the skills of many of you out there that can make these beautiful things that look like buildings in a matter of weeks. It's extraordinary. It takes me a long time to make something that looks at a building. And so to begin with, I do those charcoal sketches. We do these models in glass or porcelain or bronze in some cases. And we do those models to try to find what the architecture is and can do. And so they're sort of investigations of scale of the potential of architecture. And so thinking about a show, finally, again, as a kind of counterpoint maybe to many of the inquiries in architecture going on today, I thought that these are our tools. These bits and pieces that are all around the office and in boxes, it's really the tools that we use to try to make architecture, to find architecture, to understand architecture. So the idea that we could design some tool cases, right? That you wouldn't take these as pristine objects of art, but you'd present them as the things that we use to try to find understanding and insight. Take things, this is the model for, this is sort of like how to lose projects, by the way. you can kind of take cautionary tale here. This is a model for the Cantonale Museum in Lausanne project that we lost. I don't know why. It's walnut and it's gilt walnut. This is a model in porcelain and chopped up pencils that was reflecting the nature of the landscape in Wisconsin for the Kohler Art Museum. And this is the real loser here. I got so excited about this. It's a 1,000-foot long porch for UC Santa Cruz at the edge of a meadow, at the edge of the redwoods, looking out to the ocean. And it's a thread model, as you can see, which then ends up potentially, or had the potential of ending up in a timber structure that threaded along the landscape. Charcoal models of things that unfold. This was a project for a museum in Quebec that ended up having a concept model in bronze that ended up in a building design, which again lost. And then this actually did end up in a building concept model for the kind of stacking and compression of earth and a carving out of light, sort of holes of light and occupation in it that ended up in a winery in my home state of Oregon. So developing these toolkits or these tool cases for these bits to sort of gather them together and present them, we made 5 boxes. They're roughly 3 feet high, 3 feet square, and each of these boxes has an operation. They're either mirrored or unfolding, and they imply a sense of the infinite, that this toolkit and this exploration and these bits kind of go on forever. Things that continually unfold or unflap, drawers that you push in and push out the other side. All of these pieces, that's a peep show piece, actually, where you can see a concept model in context by looking through that little peephole, and then thinking about how to engage these pieces and present these pieces to people in a museum, developing a series of frames, kind of portals that would hold these and elevate these to eye level, and that you would walk through a series of portals and engage these pieces. We made all those walnut boxes in the office. We did not make the steel frames themselves, but just the act of bringing our thinking to pieces of that scale, which we had never done, outside of the architecture, and inviting people in then to have a relationship with these somewhat ambiguous objects. That very few of them are visually referential of buildings. So the kind of questions that it creates about what these things are and where they lie in this world of exploration and ideas and form making and materiality and craft. There's kind of a moment there, I think, that's prescient, that has everything to do with how we think and try to find and try to be inspired. It's so interesting in doing those things because you're trying to concentrate an idea in a way, similar to some of those Eva Hess pieces and other things that you see, these kind of concentrations of ideas that will inspire you then to the next scale. Things that you can't do in digital drawing, doing models that bring so much more information to the conversation than a charcoal drawing, yet precede anything that you can possibly produce in architectural drawings. They're kind of like markers along the way in the search. And sometimes we double back. We can be in design development and do a concept model because we feel like we're losing the pursuit and the complexities of the process. The National Music Center of Canada was finished a few years ago on that empty site in the middle there, illustrious context in the East Village area. This was one of those buildings which we've gotten a couple commissions to try to regenerate and make a portal to a neighborhood that is actually working and redeveloping. But our site is on both of those corners. That old hotel in the lower corner there we kind of renovated and rebuilt and then bridged across the street. But that was the context. This is the first time where I took a concept model. I have to tell a little story about this. So we were trying to do this concept model to take to the interview. And we had renderings and other stuff too, but I wanted to show, again, I don't know why I thought someone could understand this, but we were trying to do this concept model, 5-story towers, each of them with a different life, some performance, some exhibition, some education. And we were doing these things that looked far too architectural, and I said, why can't we go get a musical instrument and just cut it up? And the earnest interns in my office went to Goodwill, bought a trombone, cut it up, cast it, and milled it, and it was one of the most extraordinary things. It was like 2 days later, the first of those bits showed up, and I thought we had something there. So that went to it takes a certain kind of client that can see they want to know, so does our building have big holes, and is it made of brass, and what the hell is that thing? But there are people who can engage the potential of that and realize that it's a process of exploration. So after we got the project, I didn't want it to be autonomous bits of 5-story towers. I wanted to tie it together. I wanted it to feel like one experience, that the in-between and all of the activities in those towers would be held together by one thing. So using paper to try to find quick studies, and again, it shows the range of exploration here. Wanting to do things quicker than, again, we didn't have drawings to do anything digital with, so working in paper, then we worked in museum board, and it became much too difficult, and then moving into digital model, thinking of how these things can engage structurally and touch. And finally, this is not CNC milled, this is actually laminated pieces of wood that were all cut. Coming to these two systems of structure, one where the towers start as orthogonal and move to touch at the bottom and create giant transfer beams of 160 feet to create lobbies and common spaces. One system that is orthogonal then at the bottom rises up to the top and touches, creates the transfer spans that allow it to bridge the street, and then suspend on the right the structure over the auditorium space. And those two systems then interweave spatially in section. Very hard to describe. Digital model trying to show that. You can imagine trying to explain it to people. And I'll get to that in a minute. So then there is the issue of cladding this building. And being a museum and needing to be thermally broken, it's hard to have museums with exposed structure, although I've done it a couple times. And this one in Calgary with the requirements of the extreme weather. We clad it, and so I wanted to, similar to the Museum of Arts and Design here, I wanted to use a material that would engage and reflect and change with the light. The Northern Prairie is an extraordinary environment, and the sun angles up there are so different than what we're used to. So we went and worked again with Royal Tischelaar, the Dutch company that we worked with on MAD, trying to develop two glazes, one earthen glaze that would kind of hold this building to the site, this undeveloped site, and then a glaze, and so we ended up doing this kind of hematite slate glaze, and then a glaze that would catch the light for the inside. I mean, it's evoking that brass model, by the way. So that the inside, as the light came down between these interwoven structures, it would change with the quality of light. And that's the building, actually. So the orthogonal surfaces of the street are the slate, and when the building breaks into those forms and those transfer structures, it catches the light with what I call the platinum glaze. So the building itself, you see the orthogonal structure, and that's the lobby where number one is, and the dashed lines being these enormous transfer beams where those pieces touch and create this kind of woven space. You look up into the auditorium to the performance space, that's the suspended structure. The floors itself already beginning to switch geometries, and then touching at the top to create the bridges and the things that I spoke of. And when you look up from the ground floor, you see these things move in section. And as you move through the space, you sense that kind of volume, and you're in a kind of netherworld. It's an incredible thing. There's landscape in southern Alberta called the hoodoos, these beautiful carved sandstone columns that are carved by the wind that are quite extraordinary. And what I was attempting to do was to create an internal landscape, that in between those intense experiences of music, you would be in this place of silence that created its own sense of wonder and its own sense of connection to the outside, where the natural light comes down and views to the outside through the building, and then that reflection on that platinum glaze. And we worked with acoustic engineers. As the music comes up for the performance space, it resonates, but there's a pretty complex acoustic design to all of the surface and the gapping of the tiles. So the building itself, I had actually met David Byrne when he did the play the building thing down at the port. He designed that thing, and it inspired me to think that this performance space could actually play the building. Silence and control of light in the towers themselves, with a lot of interactive music experiences, and then back out in those gaps as you move up and down the stairs and see across and see through and see glimpses of people, and you're kind of lost in this internal landscape of music. A little bit about drawing. We didn't know how to draw this. We did not have Revit. We did not have any of those things. So combining Grasshopper and Rhino and basically doing our own 3D modeling of the entire space that then became, we like to do it the hard way here at Allied Works, became the digital model that all of the sub-consultants and engineers used. The Clifford Still Museum. I'll talk a little bit more now about, that was really about structure and the surface and its role in playing the light and what the light does to change and amplify your perception of things. Clifford Still Museum, when we won that commission, I knew his paintings quite well. I was very excited about getting it, and those incredibly powerful paintings, not only had most of them never been seen in that he did not choose to sell them, but they had never been seen in natural light. So Denver, being a prairie town, not a mountain town, is the common misconception, 300 days of sunlight a year, that intense feeling of surface, I wanted to bring the light down to the surface and really embed the building, if you will, in the earth, and really kind of hold it with the earth, hold it with the surface of the prairie, and invite that light in. These are sketches I did before the interview. And this concept model, this actually came chronologically before the National Music Center. This concept model I took to the interview, compressed charcoal, laminated rods of plexiglass to show where the light penetrates the building, and then these rooms filled with light. And again, showing this, to the client was challenging, but it resonated in this case. So then winning the commission, what do you do? Looking for how to ground this and bind it to the site. I wanted to embed the whole building in a grove of trees, which was a response to this neighborhood being quite austere and not a lot of shade. And I wanted to find the building through the landscape, through the grove of trees. So doing that sketch, doing a section sketch, coming back to a concept model later in the process, really just routing out this piece from this was actually a piece of wood we had in the basement in Oregon, where the building and the trees are one. And the goal is you never see the building as an object. You just encounter it in the kind of shade and shadow patterns of the trees, which then led to the surface of the building, which we'll talk about. Thinking about the structure, and iteration is everything. Trying to find, knowing a collection, knowing the scale of the work, knowing how many pieces they want to show, not having to do flexible, reinterpretable art space, which is very rare. Making rooms of concrete, choosing concrete. I actually initially wanted to make the building out of cast obsidian, the black glass. And I actually sourced something in Brazil, but there was technical problems to the binding of the glass and the concrete, and also probably environmental problems of shipping huge amounts of stone from Brazil. So we chose concrete to embed it to the earth and did all of those sketches. We did about 150 of these museum board models, just thinking about how the structure stacks and the kind of open network, and with the goal of always seeing through the volume, getting a sense of the entire collection, creating that sense of wonder in the labyrinth, and holding in your mind the whole collection itself while embedding it to the earth. So just a series of simple volumes, and then in section wanting to rise to the light, back to that concept model with a luminous ceiling, thinking of a way to rise to the light. It was really interesting. We did endless studies of how to bring, looking at every museum precedent we could, how to bring this light in, clear stories, scrims, and I wasn't happy with the quality. And we were looking at the building, and the surface of the building was engaging light through the shadows and the textures and patterns of the walls. But the ceiling was just making windows and making skylights. And so I said, why can't we just perforate the concrete, and we did, working with Arab engineers. So there's a series of lineal skylights above a concrete slab, site-cast concrete slab, with apertures designed to diffuse the natural light evenly across the galleries, but also penetrate down into the open storage and archive. So down below in the darker spaces, you sense people walking these gaps and these bridges and the light coming down, and you're really drawn up to the gallery floors into the light. There's an order of which walls are exposed concrete and which ones are white plaster. Getting the client to allow us to hang that art on exposed concrete walls took some effort, but we finally convinced him that it would actually amplify the presence of the art and set it off. And then looking for a palette of light that had a kind of obscure geometry. And you can see how it kind of almost dissolves into a water pattern from certain things. And it was just our attempt to make both the patterning of the formwork and the patterning of the light apertures disappear in the context of the work. So the design of the building would be less present in the experience. Wanting the building to be massive, wanting it to be present. This was during the recession. So we had a concrete contractor that had nothing to do but work with us and think about how we would place concrete. And placing concrete in a way that we couldn't control the outcome. That was my ultimate goal. Doing lifts of raw sand and gravel, adding salt, which given the reinforcing steel inside the concrete wasn't the best idea, but trying to find ways that would interact chemically with the concrete, that would interact with the pouring of the concrete. Finally ending up with just interacting with the forming of the concrete. Shag carpet was one of our best ideas, I thought, that we never used. But ending up at boards that deform, that don't stand up to the pressure, that do things that we couldn't control, and or then liquid that would pass through the gaps and break off. And that's what we ended up doing was gapping the concrete in ways that we could not control the breakage in the end. Which was very difficult to convince contractors to do, to basically break up the facade of your building in a random and uncontrolled way. But we developed a system of gaps and slots that then created these patterns of shadow. And the intent of this building from the very start for me is that the building create light and give light. So whether it's light in the evidence of shadows or light in the apertures, and always have a sense of changing perception depending on the quality of light. The aperture studies, so this was an inspiration for both the apertures and the building itself. I wished the concrete building could be a series of undulating, interlocking spaces and rooms like that. This amazing porcelain piece by Ava Hild. Extraordinary thing. I still don't know how they're made, actually. Oops. And then thinking about it relative to the apertures themselves, trying to find a patterning that didn't represent a geometric reading, and then working with Arab engineers and the structural engineers, of course, to come up with that. Everything about the building, the depth of the concrete, the apertures of the concrete, is all about diffusing the light into the space and ultimately getting a kind of shadowless space, a shadowless volume. Unbuilt projects. A few years ago, we were one of 2 finalists for the Contemporary Wing at the Met. Extraordinary opportunity, extraordinary site, and it's redoing the American Wing on the upper right corner. You know, dealing with an incredible collection, adding to that legacy of beautiful rooms, beautiful qualities of light, trying to find what we can offer, connect to the park, connect to the city, obviously back to the collections of the museums itself. Concept model of inviting the park in, extending the building out, and then bringing natural light down in those gaps into the building, the 3 stories of the building itself. And then wanting structure and light to be one again, so bringing the light down with the structure. We developed a series of concrete fins and transfer beams, probably too technical for this talk, where the structure stops, creates larger volumes of gallery, and then also diffuses the light as it moves through. Exhaustive study, again with Arup, thinking about the quality of light and how much light actually can get down to those 3 floors, how we amplify it. The building itself, opening a new entrance to the park, and really, again, inviting the city in. And that's here you see the structure both transferring and traveling through those gaps where the natural light comes in, down 3 and then eventually 4 floors. So a series of slots filled with structure and transfer beams, which become clear stories, 1 and 2 floors in, and then creating a different context on every floor, depending on the quality of light and the control of the natural light for the curators and the collection. And each gallery having the possibility of different light. So not only are there different scaled rooms, there are different qualities of light that the curators can use and control. And then the facade itself, filtering the west light from the park, connecting to the park, giving a sense of presence to the park, and becoming a lens in the end of dealing with that west light. How to take it and control it and diffuse it. And we developed a series of cast glass panels that could have different layers of translucency, opacity, texturing to both amplify, modify, diffuse the light going into the building, and also give you a sense of the life and activity of the museum itself from the park. Again, the structural fins exposed on the south side of the building, and again, the kind of ever-changing qualities of that surface. Some other projects, the Embassy project, which is under construction now, I can't remember the chronology, but it's close to the time of the Clifford Still or just after that. Understanding, it's kind of an amazing thing where the sky dome data for the whole globe exists now. So we can design a building that invites in natural light and control the quality of that light, on a kind of average on this surface, on November 25th. And we can work with the engineers to design that and control that. It's an extraordinary thing. So this site is on the ocean, the Indian Ocean. It's for 450 government workers, all different U.S. agencies. This was part of the design excellence. I think this was the second project after the London project. And simple bars, which are sort of prescribed by the functions inside, by the State Department, opening them up for views out as you travel between those office blocks, opening up to the views of the ocean, and then creating this skin that controls the sunlight in the workspace itself. The section, transparency was part of the mission, wanting these buildings to not be these fortress, while responding to all the security issues, not wanting them to become fortresses. So transparency up into the workings, even if you aren't invited in through the security barriers, and then transparency back to the landscape. And wanting the building to open up to the views and the light and the amazing context itself. So creating a structural screen with bomb blast redundancy and using this data to create basically a 4-foot deep serrated concrete skin with apertures designed to let sun in, to prevent sun from coming in during work hours. So creating these very large openings whose geometry and depth are set by the data. And some of them you can see almost 1.5 meters. These are large openings, very large openings. And they can face south and west and east, and no sun comes in 9 o'clock to 4 o'clock. It's an extraordinary thing. So each facade has its own geometry, has its own structural qualities, applied then to the surface of the building. So two structural projects, kind of pure structural projects, current things. This was very fun. I have children that play soccer, one professionally, so I've been quite a soccer fan, and I'm from Portland, Oregon. For any of you that follow the MLS, they win a few national championships. So I invited out the owner for a drink because I'd never been around anybody that won a national championship. And I just wanted to bask in the glow, and I asked them what they're going to do with the stadium. This is not the stadium. I asked them what they're going to do with the stadium. Are they going to move to the suburbs? How are they going to grow and pay for these players and in a league that is growing very, very quickly? And they wanted to stay in the city. And so I volunteered to do a study. I do museums and animation studios, things like that. And I volunteered to do a study for them. And it's a landlocked stadium. I'll show you in a second. And we found this stadium, the Bombonera in Argentina, that's landlocked. And this piece over to the right, this vertical, what I call Shakespearean sort of soccer stadium. And we proposed it then for the timbers. And the curved bit is the existing building. The bit at the bottom is the piece we did, which is 4 stories of vertical stands, which become the structure of this enormous 150-foot cantilever. So it's vertical seats with 8 or 10 rows, and then a very, very large canopy that we wrap over a very simple concrete frame and tie it back to the street. So looking for a quality of that structure, looking for an order to that structure, trying to make something diaphanous that sort of floats in the mist and fog of the city of Portland, Oregon, looking at braids and weaves, all kinds of different ways of thinking about structure. And again, this in an industry that uses very simple truss work most of the time. It's an emerging league. But anyway, trying to find something to pursue to allow us to think of the presence of the structure in the space. So weaving together this piece, allowing it to be assembled, making them integral in some way, and then all tied back to the street itself with these tension members. And that's where the design is today. And it starts construction momentarily, actually in the next month. The last bit. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum. I can talk quite a while about dealing with this idea of a memorial for veterans, what it means. This project was inspired by Senator John Glenn before he passed away, and I think this is what really drew me to the project. It's in Columbus, Ohio, where he's from Ohio. But his desire was to make a memorial and a museum that elevated the idea of service. And I had been thinking about that quite a bit in my life and career, and the notion of we as a culture giving something beyond ourselves and our own interest, and how, without organized religion, with various political views of military service, how we were losing the sense of importance of that. So got to work with Ralph Applebaum to develop a museum and memorial that talks about that idea, uses military to talk about not war, but the idea of service and sacrifice. So the site itself, very, very large site, very small building, 30,000 square feet. I think it got a little bit bigger. So I looked at how to mark that surface, how to hold the ground, how to occupy that space with a building that was kind of too small to do that. So began by just carving the earth and lifting up the earth, creating a ceremonial pathway from the park and the street, what I call a processional, up to this sanctuary, where they have memorials, decommissioning things, all kinds of different events and services, welcoming service people home, this kind of rooftop amphitheater, if you will, place of reflection, quiet place to be in the city. It's right across the river from downtown. But that was really the design, and there was no really museum under it, and there was no really structure under it in the beginning. It was just this idea of lifting the earth up from the surface of this park. So thinking how to create the structure, creating 30-foot spans, sort of moving from the outside to the inside. These are porcelain models, how to interweave these layers as you enter into the space and kind of spin in from the landscape. The idea of the building being lifted from the earth and sort of torn from the earth then resulted in these studying concrete again very large cantilevered concrete arches, about 165 to 185 feet, that weave together, and they're cantilevered in that they lean outwards. So they have to be held together by a very large tension ring at the roof. And that was the early studies of trying to rationalize them and then modify them with the rise of the ramp and the rise and fall of the spaces inside the galleries, and then working with the engineers on that system. We went through a couple engineers. Very difficult thing to engineer and build. And everything that's orange and red basically says you're screwed. So yeah, as we as architects draw these nice 4-foot deep beams, they suddenly become 8 and 10 and 9 and the things that they actually need to do. But it was extremely challenging. There's an anecdote. There's also another anecdote with this project. We worked with a pre-selected contractor, a concrete builder, and we were all on board, and they got to the final price and the final month away from construction, and the concrete contractor quit. It was too complex. They didn't want to build it. And we couldn't find anybody to build the building. And it's a crazy position to be when you can, it's complex enough to draw and design, incredibly complex to engineer. And it was a lesson for me that you can conceive of things that maybe no one wants to build. You're kind of ahead of the industry. Why would they do that when they can go out to the suburbs and build some, whatever they build out there, And so for 2 months we had no contractor. We had no one to do this. So we finally found someone who would build the building. And it opens in about 9 months. So you can see the 3 rings of concrete that kind of fold apart. You can kind of slip in and move between them. These arches that move inside, and you move through the ramp and through the entrance there. You can see the doors. And then rise up both inside and outside through the 3 floors to the roof. And it's kind of an incredible thing. That's just beginning to do the steel. In some of the areas, there's 11 layers of rebar. It's basically a textile building. I should have made the building out of thread. See, that's why I should have done that. But it is really, really, truly, and conceptually a textile building. It's woven with reinforcing steel. It's just held by the concrete. These are photos from a month or so ago, looking through the different layers. And of course, the light changes as it comes in. The glass isn't in yet, those openings, but those will be the openings. With the curving of the concrete, the light continually changes from dark to light. And you're just held and woven in this structural body. And I still can't believe we got this built, to tell you the truth. It's kind of an amazing thing. So, the nature of the investigation, I just want to wrap up with a couple thoughts on that. I care very deeply about architecture. I think it has a absolutely unique voice in the kind of culture of making and what it can communicate and what it can amplify, what perceptions it can present. It does things that no other art and no other medium does, but I think the careful thought in what it can and should and could do is absolutely critical, because when it's not considered carefully, it demeans architecture. It diminishes its ability to communicate. It diminishes its value in our culture. It's much more than a commodity, and it has tremendous, tremendous potency. But it's only as potent as the intention that goes into it. And thus, you see, our perhaps way too labored and way too long of investigations, but it is only in hopes that architecture can bring something, can bring a voice to a community or a place or an activity of life that nothing else can. So thank you for coming. I'd love to take some questions, if there are any questions. maybe there's no questions. Didn't we hire someone to be a shill here and ask the, isn't that how?
So thanks very much for the talk. Beautiful work, beautiful process. And, a great talk I think to have in school. So thanks for that. Would you talk a little bit more about the dialogue? So here you have this building that you can conceive, you've engineered it,
Yeah.
it's been drawn, it's been, I guess, bid and priced. So there are a lot of
Yeah.
people who think
Yeah.
it's possible, and yet the most important people that you need
Yeah.
to join you in this incredibly
Mhm.
ambitious and risky endeavor are like fleeing. So
Yeah.
so how
Yeah.
how did you finally find the people who were willing to take this chance with you? And what was, if you could talk a little bit about the dialogue that was necessary so that you could bring them on board with confidence and mutual confidence and mutual ambition.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's interesting. I think, my practice is really modeled on art practice. I mean, you look at the process, right? It's just about pursuing the ideas, right? And we've become very skilled architects, so we know how to draw them, and we know how to, we know how to push the edge of the possible now, right? And sometimes you go too far. And that had never occurred to me, never ever occurred to me, right? And there's a convention, there's an industry of conventions. We don't just get to make amazing things in the studio and go out to the foundry and all those wonderful things we get to do in the concept models. We have to, and you have to gather in 150, 200 people, and $50 million to build these things. So it's given us pause as an office, frankly. It really has. I mean, I won't name names, but there's a lot of architects we compete against that do boxes. And I would probably save my office years of off their lives if I would just do boxes, because it's really hard when the risk involved in this. I had never thought about risk, the actual risk of this structure, which we couldn't even find people to engineer initially, and how to build it and what it's going to do, standing up there for 10 years, my God, that's night terror for me forever, right? There's a limit. And I think between the National Music Center and this, I don't know. It's an interesting point, because we got it built, right? But it's a different form of, we would be a very small office if this is all we did. And so there's choices you have to make too. If you're going to just pursue this kind of, always trying to press forward with what you think is the right thing and what's inspired by the place and the context and the ideas and the content, and try to invent something, you have to have a client that'll do the risk, which is extremely rare, right? I mean, we had Les Wexner as the main patron behind this, and he happens to be a fan of architecture, so he was engaged and intrigued. And so, you can't do this kind of work outside of a patronage culture, I think. It's really what it comes down to. Who can go there? Because, what happens if we couldn't find someone to build? There was 2 months. I kept getting phone calls. And so we just went all over the region trying to find people and bring in people. We went all over the East Coast and found a company to actually do it, who is amazing, who is up for it, and didn't charge us exorbitantly, actually. More than we had planned, but not crazy. There's that.
Have they done something similar?
Nobody's done something. I'm not trying to. Nobody. But they were excited by it. Builders love to build amazing things. But again, it takes a person who has the capacity for risk when you don't know how to build it. Yeah. You know how to design it, you know how to engineer it, you know how to draw it, but no one knows how to build it. Yeah. Is that it?
How do you get scale right? multiple projects on the side, and also like translating from medium for
Scale is the hardest thing, especially working in structure. I remember the St. Louis Art Museum, Contemporary Art Museum, first museum I did, kind of woven concrete structural walls, big deep walls, 2 stories. Blair Kamen from the Chicago Tribune. This is one of the days when there were architecture critics. I think he's still writing. He might be one of 2 or 3 left. But this is the day of architecture critics. And he said something about, it was one of the smallest, some remark about how the building was so small yet so monumental, and the monumentality and the size were off. And it was just a knife to the heart, because he was absolutely right. And I think dealing in structure, when structure is the generator of form and the kind of primary perception of the space, how you find your body, how you as an individual can find yourself and occupy that place and be comfortable is extremely challenging. And it's really, really, really hard. It's really hard to learn. And it requires the secondary scale things being important, the detailing and finishes and the materiality and the railings and all those things have to kind of hold you in that volume, because these volumes are landscape. I mean, that's a landscape piece. It was designed as a landscape piece. It was designed as, to occupy a site that's, acres. And how do you come in there and have an intimate relationship with some family's loss, in wartime, and how do you get that sense of intimacy in that is extremely, it takes everything. It takes all elements of the conversation. Yeah, I love that question, because it's really challenging. It's part of the thing we do with the concept models is they're projections of scale. I mean, if you think about what we do as architects, it's totally nutty. It's just nutty, right? Someone gives us $100 million, God knows, to make up something that no one knows what it is, right? And they can never see it. Right? I mean, you can do a rendering, but you have no idea what you're doing. It's incredible. It's just the most incredible leap of faith that people make in this profession. I mean, if you really think about how nutty it is. It's like nothing else. It's like nothing else. And so the responsibility is just enormous, enormous, enormous.
Brad, beautiful presentation, and you were very careful helping us understand a great series of sources from nature to art, and yet somehow you leave out architectural references. And I know that all of these buildings are incredibly erudite and have a great resource in architectural typology and the history and culture of architecture, and yet somehow you don't reveal all of them. A lot of that is encrypted in the artistic process of your explorations, one medium or the other, and yet you don't even, you have a sensibility, but you don't have an authorship that's centralized. It's quite dispersed. You've explored many different materials and many different iconographies, if I can say that word. But I wonder, through the work that you do you think of yourself as speaking to other architects? And if so, who are they? And, or how do you speak to architecture industry? If I had to ask you that.
That's a really hard question. I think my inspiration in architecture came early, right? It came in wanting to work in scale. I think it began with growing up in the landscape in the West Coast and being awestruck by beautiful, powerful Western landscape. And so the scale of architecture, I think, linked up with that sensibility. And then in younger days, studying, learning from architects, going to beautiful buildings and amazing spaces, and learning and believing the power of architecture, of the medium itself. through all of these amazing buildings. And so it gave me the confidence, it gave me the reference and the memory of some of these spaces, knowledge when you really try to understand how they achieved it. And now I just look for inspiration. Now I think, I look and I think about architecture, but I think mostly about ideas and just possibilities and just take it where it comes, I think, in that way. And it's agnostic. I mean, it was really interesting. What set me free in some ways, the first book I did, Occupation, I talked to various makers. And I talked to Ann Hamilton and Doug Aiken and other people about their process, their pursuit, and the commonality of ideas and investigations and concerns. I was really just set free. It's not, it's what we do and the world of ideas is out there and open, and everyone's involved in the conversation, and it kind of set me free, in a way, from architecture, I guess, or allowed me to just think of architecture as part of a conversation of every medium, but again, with its own scale, its own voice, its own mission. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
You are. You're answering my question by avoiding it.
No, it's not, but it's not avoided. It really isn't avoidance. It's really not, I swear.
My hunch is that there's a very strategic mind or team behind all of this, because otherwise
Yeah, somewhere in the office there's that.
the industry would trounce you. They would beat the hell out of you because they would refuse to
Well, they kind of do.
adopt the kind of detailing and anticipation and forecasting that you go through. So I'm begging for just a little bit of a treat here.
Well, I'm just trying to get at what it. I just don't know if I think of it the same way you're asking. But let me. So, craft has mattered. Well, buildings matter. Building beautiful buildings matters to me more than anything. And beautiful in a way, I mean that they're so considered that they carry value, and that if you give me $100 million, I give you something that holds the value of that to that city and that culture and that institution. So craft is everything to me. And you building beautifully and building in a way that lasts and matters and communicates that kind of intention. That has imbued the practice forever from the beginning, I think, that ethic of it. And it's also allowed us to do these kinds of speculative. When we did, this is be very candid here, when we did Clifford Still Museum, I was awestruck by the people in my office, our ability to detail, to figure out how to build that building for $15 million. It was so cheap. And the resonance of that building and the quality of the detail and the innovation, it was just amazing. And it gave me the confidence. Basically, that's what gave me the confidence to do this, for better or worse, right? So kind of mastery of the language, right, in a way that allows me to imagine things I never could imagine responses that I couldn't do, comes from the confidence of my studio, the people in my office. Give me the confidence to know that we can do this. So there's a practice intent, very rooted, I guess, in architecture. And we want to build. I think that's the other thing too. I don't want to design things that don't get built. I have no interest in that. I want to build these things. So trying to find that spot, that seam, where they actually build it, is huge. And I think, again, a lot of knowledge over the last 30 years of where that is and how we can push it just a couple steps. Yeah, because we're makers. The buildings are intended to be built.
Following up that thought, there are a number, very few iconic buildings in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
The three that I'm thinking of ran into a great deal of difficulty with the authority having jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Bronx, Upper Manhattan Bus Terminal,
Mm.
Guggenheim,
Yeah.
and the clamshell that Saarinen built for TWA.
Mm-hmm.
After they were built, they were revered.
Mm-hmm.
But to get past the authority
But so what I've told people in my office forever is we have to do everyone's job for them. So part of the responsibility of designing these things is you have to know how to convince the city and convince the patrons, and it's part of the design. It's all part of the design. To design these things and just put it out there in the world, you would fail. You would just or you'd be extremely lucky. Or you have the gravitas of a Frank Lloyd Wright to do that. I mean, gravitas goes a long way, but you have to design the process. I knew the engineering possibilities of this is the only way we got it built. I knew it was built. I knew you could engineer this. I knew the principles that we were pursuing. I didn't just make a funny shape and say someone engineer it. I made a shape that I knew had structural qualities that I knew we could do. So you just have to you have to own the process.
Did you ever encounter an authority having jurisdiction that said you can't build it, it won't work?
We encounter that at every level, every day, by everyone. Yeah, but you just have to be.
How do you overcome it?
You have to be smarter than them. You have to be smart. You have to look out for them. Someone says no because they're afraid. So you have to figure out how to make them comfortable. You have to protect them. That's what it really is. You have to protect people. And then they'll take a risk with you. If they feel like you're looking out for them. When I was younger, I would just fight with everybody. But I didn't get very far. But no, if you make people safe, then they'll come with you. It takes some work, but yeah, it's funny. Rather than fighting, which was my natural tendency, empathy for these people goes a lot farther. It took me a long time.
Well, I can tell you, I think Mr. Feltman would be very happy
That's nice.
if he were alive today and would hear this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.